Hi, I'm Bridget. Welcome to my kitchen where I elevate the everyday with inspiring recipes that are doable for any cook. Today we're making easy pies for the Pastry Challenged, beginning with a simple food processor pastry. And to simplify even further, our pies are free-form galettes, so no fiddling with pastry. You'll see that today's sweet and savory galettes, one pear, one zucchini, really are easy as pie. If you love pie but find making homemade pie a little fiddly, I have a solution. Make a galette, a free-form tart that offers all of the pleasure of a homemade pie with half the effort. You simply roll a big round of pastry, lay it on a cookie sheet, pile the filling on top and fold over the pastry edges. That's it. No crust to fit into a pan, no top crust to crimp. It really is that simple. I know pastry can seem intimidating, but it really can be simple. I always make mine in the food processor because it's quick and fail-proof. We'll start with 2 cups of all-purpose flour. Now this original recipe calls for all-purpose flour, but I'm including a little bit of spelt flour. Just 6 tablespoons. And this recipe makes enough for 2 galettes, and it's actually half of the original recipe, which you could make, and then you'll just have tons of pastry to put in the freezer, which is the handy thing about pastry, because any leftovers can be frozen. So 6 tablespoons of spelt, which is 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons. So in total, we've got 2 cups and 6 tablespoons of flour. And to that, I'm going to add 3/4 teaspoon of baking powder, which is a little unusual for pastry, but it's part of what makes this pastry nice and flaky. I'm adding just half a teaspoon of salt. And then the other unusual thing about this recipe is that it has an egg in it. Now again, because this is a half recipe, we're only going to use half of the beaten egg. Now before we add the liquid and before we add the butter, I'm just going to whir those ingredients, the dry ingredients a bit to combine. All right, so next is our butter. This is a full cup of icy cold butter. I've cut it into chunks to help it break up more easily when I pulse it with the flour. You can even cut your butter into chunks and put it in the freezer right up until you're ready to make your pastry, because nice cold butter is key to a flaky pastry. Now I'm just going to pulse this until the butter is in pea-sized pieces. And that is perfect. You want to make sure that you still have some good-sized pieces of butter before we add the liquid. And the liquid is 1/4 cup of very cold milk. And I'm just going to get 1/4 cup of ice cold water. Mix them together. Then remember, we're only going to use half of the beaten egg. We'll use the rest of the egg to brush the edges of our galette before it goes in the oven. So liquid goes in. At this point, you want to be really careful as you combine the liquid with the dry. I'm going to pulse it just until it starts to come together in a ball. right. So I'm just going to scrape this onto the counter. See, it hasn't fully come into a ball, but almost completely. If I had kept processing it, then the butter would have blended in too smoothly, and I don't want that. And I'm just going to gently form it into a ball. And you won't need any extra flour on the counter surface for this. And it's a nice smooth dough. That's a beautiful thing about this pastry with the egg in it. The texture of it is really lovely to work with. And I'm just going to cut it in half and form each half into a ball. I don't want to handle it too much because the heat from my hands will start to melt the butter. Form into 2 balls, 1 per galette. Then I'm going to flatten it into a disc and try to keep it as round as possible. You'll thank me later when it comes to rolling these out. There, and into the fridge for an hour, at least an hour. Remember, we're making 2 galettes today, a fruit and a vegetable, sweet and savory. We'll start with the fruit galette made with pears. It's a simple way to showcase their lovely flavor. When I make fruit galettes, I always make a bit of a base to put between the pastry and the fruit. It sops up any juices and keeps the bottom crust from getting soggy. For this recipe, I use almond meal or almond flour, and it adds a bit of a marzipan flavor that's great with pears. It's delicious. I start with 1/4 cup of almond flour, and to that I'm going to add just 1 tablespoon of all-purpose flour, 3 tablespoons of sugar, and then I'm just going to beat into that 1 large egg. Now I'll let this mixture sit in the fridge while I prep the pears and the pastry, and it just helps everything soak together so it gets that marzipan kind of texture. So we've got that well mixed, and now we'll get going on our pears. For this galette, you'll need 2 to 3 pears. I buy my pears every few days or a couple of times a week if I want to bake with them, just because you want them that perfect ripeness. You want them firm ripe, not too soft, or they'll go to mush when you're trying to slice them. I love using a vegetable peeler for pears because it just takes a thin coat of the skin and you don't lose any of the flesh. I'll do a 3rd pear just in case. Probably won't need all of it. Now to slice the pears, I'm going to quarter them and core them, and then cut them into slices that are no more than 1/4 inch thick. Because we lay these thin slices in a single layer when we're assembling the tart, it ends up looking like a flower. It's very pretty. To help move the assembly or the making of this galette along a little faster, you can make the pastry well in advance. As I mentioned, you can always put it in the freezer or store it in the fridge for a better part of a week. But even that marzipan mixture can be made several days ahead of time and just left in the fridge. So if you have those pieces already, then all you need to do is prep the pears. And also, before we started with the pears, I took the pastry out of the fridge so it can start to warm a little bit. I still want it to be cool to the touch when I start to roll it out. I don't want it to get that warm, but it will make it easier with the rolling pin if it's has warmed up a little bit. I'm just going to slice half of this third pear, thinking that I probably won't need all of it. All right, next up is rolling out the pastry. So I've just got a lightly floured surface here. And I will flatten this disc of pastry a little bit more. But you can even see the pieces of butter still in it, so it's nice that it didn't get blended too much. And we'll just start rolling it out. And you don't have to roll it into a perfect circle. Don't worry about that. That's the nice thing about a rustic galette. But try to keep it at least as round as possible. And we're going to roll this to about 1/8 of an inch. I like to use a good old-fashioned rolling pin. Sometimes I do use a French rolling pin. Got one right here. And if my dough is softer than this pastry, then I'll use the French rolling pin. But when dough is right out of the freezer, I find that the heavy rolling pin, I find that the weight of the heavy rolling pin just makes the whole job easier. So this is nice and thin. Just give it one more pass. Now that our pastry is rolled to about 1/8 of an inch, just going to put it on a parchment-lined baking sheet before we assemble it. Now always remember to get it on the baking sheet before you start to put the toppings on. Otherwise it's really difficult to move a loaded galette that has not yet been baked from the counter to a baking sheet. We're ready to assemble our galette, starting with our almond mixture, that nice marzipan mixture. And I'm going to spread it on top of the pastry, but I'm going to leave about a 2.5 inch border. Doesn't have to be perfect, but we just want to leave some space because the border of this galette is going to be folded up over the pears. And then we can start making our flower blossom. I used to kind of labor over this, trying to make it look perfect like in pictures I've seen, but really you can just keep it going in a spiral and it will look so pretty once it's baked anyway. We're just going to sprinkle this with sugar before we put it in the oven. Another option, if you wanted it to be very shiny, you could glaze it with a little bit of jelly or like an apricot jam or something, and that would make it very slick. And again, I'm following that kind of 2.5 inch guideline, leaving lots of space to roll the dough over. And I'm just going to roll the edges of the pastry up, kind of folding it in on itself. And then, remember that leftover egg we had from when we made the pastry? I'm just going to lightly brush the edges of the pastry. It'll make it a really nice golden color when it comes out of the oven. Now I've preheated the oven to 375 degrees, and this will bake for about 45 minutes. Our final step is to sprinkle over a tablespoon of sugar. And now our galette is ready for the oven. While our pear galette is in the oven, let's move on to the savory galette made with zucchini. You can stuff just about any vegetable into pastry and it will taste good. Throughout the summer and fall, I make a lot of vegetable galettes. This version, made with thinly sliced zucchini, is a favorite. It makes a great lunch or light supper with a salad on the side. Or sometimes I serve it as a nibble with drinks. We'll start with 3 cups of sliced zucchini and fairly thinly sliced zucchini. And to that, we're going to add half an onion, thinly sliced, a little bit of garlic, 1 clove, some herbs, and a little bit of olive oil. To our 3 cups of sliced zucchini, I'm going to add the onion, sliced quite thin. And we'll add 1 clove of garlic. You can always make this more garlicky if you'd like. And a good amount of freshly ground pepper. And about half a teaspoon of salt. And then about half a tablespoon or a little more of olive oil. We'll toss this, and we're actually going to put this in the oven on a parchment-lined baking sheet just for a few minutes while we prep our pastry. I find if the zucchini gets cooking a little bit ahead of time, then it's a lot softer. It has a really beautiful texture when the galette is baked and comes out of the oven. So I've got our baking sheet all prepped. And I'll put it in the oven alongside our pear galette that's still baking. Try to get it in a single layer. And really, this is only going to pre-cook for about 10 minutes. And we're just going to tuck our zucchini in the oven for a little bit while we get our pastry ready. Okay, so let's get our pastry rolled out for the zucchini galette. So same drill as last time, lightly floured surface. We'll flatten our disc of pastry just a little bit more. And roll it out as much in a circle as possible. But like the pear galette, doesn't need to be perfect. And again, try not to use too much flour, but you don't want your pastry to stick to the rolling pin either. This is a really beautiful pastry to work with. It's just so soft and pliable. And we'll want to get it to 1/8 of an inch. This needs just a little bit more. I think I'm going just a bit too light with my flour. There we go. So let's just set our pastry aside for a minute or two. Well, we put together a few more things that go in our filling, starting with half a cup of crumbled feta. And we'll add a quarter of a cup of Parmesan. These proportions don't need to be perfect. And we're adding a teaspoon of herbs. So you can use basil, oregano, an Italian blend, or instead of herbs, if you wanted, you could use some kind of spice if you prefer, like a Southwest blend or a Cajun seasoning. Any of those kinds of flavors would be great with this mixture. And finally, this filling has an egg in it. So I'll just beat the egg, add it to our cheese, and then I'll get the zucchini out of the oven. So let's get our zucchini out of the oven and into our mixture. Oh, and our Pear Galette will soon be ready. I'm just going to scrape it into the bowl with the other ingredients, mixing as I go. Don't worry about the egg cooking with the hot zucchini. That's just fine because it's mixed with those other ingredients. And I'll just set that aside. I'm going to use the same cookie sheet as well for our pastry. No need to dirty extra dishes. So same as before. I'm going to put the pastry down before I load it up. And actually the zucchini isn't super hot now that it's mixed with our other ingredients. And we'll just kind of spread it to leave a couple of inches or 2.5 inches boundary. So there's pastry to fold up over. And we'll just start our folding. I'm moving a little faster because of the heat. I want to get this pastry in the oven quickly to start cooking. And I'm going to sprinkle over just a little bit more Parmesan. So our zucchini galette is ready for the oven, but I think our Pear Galette is ready to come out. So we'll check on that first. And it is bubbling and golden. So let's just get our zucchini galette in the oven, and then I'll show you the Pear Galette. Our galette is lovely and golden, and it's puffed up a little bit thanks to the egg that's in that delicious marzipan mixture. So we'll let it cool before we slice it. I took a peek at our zucchini galette and it's ready to come out of the oven. And like the Pear Galette, it has a beautiful golden color and it's bubbling. No need to be intimidated by the thought of making pie from scratch. This versatile pastry recipe goes to show that if you have 5 minutes to spare, you can make your own pastry. And using the freeform tart approach, or galette, assembling the pie is doable for anyone. Next time you get together with friends, surprise them with a homemade galette or two. I hope you enjoy these recipes in your kitchen too.